bringing you more analysis now on our top stories today. Joining us live is Jim Middleton, the former political journalist and now advisor to the lobbying firm Counsel House. Jim, good to see you. Appreciate your time. We're seeing woes today for two big Australian companies, two big brands, Holden and Coles, of course. If we start with Holden, mud, of course, is being flung in all directions. How do you think we've got to this point with this brand being retired despite the billions in government support in recent years?
Good afternoon to you, Ash. Look, it was pretty well inevitable, was it not, that Holden would eventually pull out of the Australian market once the government, that is the Abbott government back in 2013-14, decided not to provide any more support to the company. And also you had then Treasurer Joe Hockey effectively daring Holden to pull out as a result of the situation that it found itself in and the fact that the government was not about to provide any more subsidies to the car-making business. One of the things that I think has really struck me about this is that it's more than simply a company pulling out of Australia. It's a brand which goes back in many ways to World War II, to the lifestyle that many Australians, myself included, remember from our youth and childhood with the I didn't drive a Holden as a youth, but well, I did. In fact, my father had an EH, and a very, very fine car it was indeed. And I'm sure my experience is very similar to many others. It was part of the Australian lifestyle of the time, along with holidays at the beach, eskies, thongs, stubbies, and so on and so forth. And so it does mean more than simply the disappearance of yet another car company from the Australian market. But I think it's a bit rich also, Ash, for the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to be so angry publicly about this when he, after all, was a member of the Cabinet who back in 2013 and 14 decided that he would not and they would not support the car industry any further. There had been warnings from the company that without subsidies its place in the Australian market was very vulnerable indeed, and so eventually it has turned out.
Yeah, and when it comes down to it, do we be angry with customers? Because the problem seems to be, Jim, that everyone has lovely memories about Holden the brand, but no one's actually buying the cars anymore to the level that means that it could have been sustainable going forward. That's
a very, very good point. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if you go back to the heyday of Holdens in the 60s and 70s, they were selling something like 400,000 or 500,000 cars a year. By the time we get to 2013, it was down into the 100,000 or so. This was not sustainable. They were not building the cars anymore that Australians wanted to drive. Add to that a peculiar circumstance in that time, which was the relatively high value of the Australian dollar, made imports even more attractive than they had otherwise been. And really you could see that the writing was on the wall for Holden, and so unfortunately for the company and for all those thousands of people who enjoyed secure employment through the years, and people like myself who remember the Holdens with affection and nostalgia, it is to be no more.
Just looking at the underpayment of staff by Coles, only the latest corporation, of course, to be caught out or admitting in this case that they have underpaid staff to the tune of millions of dollars. We heard from Christian Porter, the Attorney General, earlier, and it looks like we can expect to see soon some much tougher sanctions for corporations who make this huge mistake of underpaying these staff.
Well, it would appear that there does need to be something of a revamping of penalties. We now have what is an embarrassment for the Morrison government, but also an embarrassment for what are the two biggest retailers in the country, both Coles and Woolies, being found to have underpaid their staff. They're very, very good and have very, very sophisticated accounting systems which make sure that they certainly do not pay 1 cent more tax than they think they owe the tax office. But when it comes to paying their staff, we have a situation where there appears to have been chronic underpayments in both of these big retailers. It's interesting, is it not, when you look at it, the ACTU was noting a week or two ago that George Columbaris, whose restaurant chain went under, had underpaid something like $8 million over a very lengthy period of time. He was effectively fined, ordered to make a restitution payment of around $200,000. Around about the same time, one of the unions, not the CFMEU I should stress, was fined by the Fair Work Commission well over $400,000 for getting some what appeared to be relatively innocuous paperwork wrong. Now, in those circumstances, it would seem, would it not, that if this practice is to be brought to book, then fines will have to be much, much more significant than the payments we have seen to date.
Yeah, we're looking at criminal sanctions, according to Christian Porter, going forward when it comes to those deliberate acts. And of course, that's probably one of the key words there, is trying to prove that this sort of action is deliberate is always where it gets pretty tough. Jim, I do just want to ask you about the coronavirus as well. It is obviously a huge challenge on the health front. It's a huge challenge for the economy, but also when it comes to diplomacy between China and pretty much the rest of the world, there are big issues here. We heard from the Chinese ambassador to Australia here on Sky News yesterday. He was interviewed by our chief anchor, Kieran Gilbert, and we saw there this tension between the action that the government here in Australia is taking and what China would like us to be doing in response to the crisis.
Yeah, it's quite a coup for Kieran Gilbert. It's not very often that the Chinese ambassador appears on television. I remember in a different incarnation about 10 years ago, I got a couple of interviews, but that was in a different time and a different place. But yes, look, I don't think really that China's got much of a leg to stand on when you particularly notice that in the last 24 hours it found it necessary to postpone, if not cancel, this year's meeting of the National People's Congress, which is one of its very important policy-making bodies, simply because of coronavirus. Also, more and more information coming out of China that because of the authoritarian nature of its government, that there were delays in information getting up the food chain, as it were, about the fact that this virus had struck Wuhan and Hubei province. And indeed, the local government seeking to threatening doctors and others with criminal sanctions if they were to report it. And in those circumstances, I really don't think that the Chinese have got much of a leg to stand on in terms of lecturing the rest of the world about this terrible virus, which may now be peaking in its effects, but it's had a considerable impact on the health not only of people within China, and fatally so in some circumstances unfortunately, but on a number of other nations around the world, including Australia, and it may well too have a very significant effect on the global economy too, and that is a responsibility which will not only harm the people of China, but also the economies and people of countries like Australia as well.
Jim, is that mistrust directed at China from right around the world, is it justified in your view?
Well, there's always been a suspicion, has there not, about the quality of reporting of official matters within China, whether it be its economic data or otherwise. And in these circumstances, as more and more information trickles out, we discover what the hierarchy knew right up to Xi Jinping and when he knew it, and what was being told to the rest of the world, and also the behaviour, as we saw the poor doctor in Wuhan who raised the alarm sometime in December, was warned about that and told to shut up. Eventually it was acknowledged, and now it turns out that he is one of those who unfortunately has died as a consequence of coronavirus. Had the information been, or had the Chinese authorities been more candid earlier, it may well have been that the virus would have spread, but maybe not so catastrophically, and not necessarily outside China as much as has now been the case.